I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. About 2 million vaccines are due to arrive in Canada this week, including a first shipment of single-dose shots from Johnson & Johnson. The government expects to receive about 300,000 doses of the J&J vaccine, 1 million Pfizer shots, and 650,000 doses of the Moderna vaccine. Public Procurement Minister Anita Anand said last week that Canada was in talks with the U.S. to try and acquire some of its stockpile of AstraZeneca. Nearly 7,000 new COVID-19 cases were reported nationwide Sunday, bringing the total number since the pandemic began to almost 1.18 million. Another 38 deaths were also reported Sunday, lifting the national total to 23,965. Provincially, Ontario had the most new cases with just under 4,000, followed by Alberta at just over 1,400 and Quebec at about 1,000. Nova Scotia reported its highest daily case count since the pandemic began with 63, prompting Premier Ian Rankin to demand residents stay home and remain in their communities. The Conservatives are pressing for more hearings, suggesting Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's chief of staff knew about a misconduct allegation against now retired General Jonathan Vance. Conservative members are asking for the hearings following Friday's testimony from former Trudeau advisor Elder Marquis. He said he was directed by Mr. Trudeau's top aide, Katie Telford, or her assistant, to reach out to Defence Minister Harjit Sajjan's office on March 2018 to discuss an allegation against Mr. Vance. That testimony appeared to contradict the timing laid out by Mr. Sajjan. A senior Air Force officer says Canada's military pilots are in danger of losing their edge as COVID-19 restrictions curtail their ability to conduct training exercises. The Air Force isn't the only part of the military facing challenges due to the pandemic, particularly when it comes to training. The Canadian Army is planning to hold its largest and most important training exercise in Alberta next week after cancelling last year's iteration. More than 1,000 dock workers at the Port of Montreal began a strike this morning, a move that the Port Authority says will mean a total shutdown of all port operations. Dock workers are putting pressure on the Maritime Employers Association to reach a contract because they haven't had one since December 2018. Labour Minister Philomena Tassi says the government will table back-to-work legislation if an agreement is not reached to prevent significant and potentially long-lasting harm to Canada's economy. The Canadian Council for Refugees wants the federal government to set a standard of 6 months to reunite children with their parents. Executive Director Janet Dench says many refugee and immigrant families are currently waiting years, which is unacceptable. A spokesman for the Immigration Minister says the department is prioritizing applications from refugees sponsoring their dependents and assessing the results of 2 pilot programs to improve processing times. Future nurses say the COVID-19 pandemic is fueling their commitment for their career choice. Elizabeth Saywick, the director of the University of BC School of Nursing, says a number of applicants over the last year have mentioned the pandemic has exposed inequities and motivated them to become a nurse. Leslie Mack, assistant dean at the University of Toronto School of Nursing, says applications for the undergraduate program have jumped by almost 25%, and those for the graduate degree have risen by around 20%. Multiple reports are expected this week on the Canadian business front. Canadian National Railway Corporation will release its first quarter results today. Statistics Canada will release retail trade figures for February on Wednesday. Retail sales fell for a second consecutive month in January as many non-essential retailers were forced to restrict in-person shopping due to the pandemic. BCE holds a conference call on Thursday to discuss its first quarter results, and Statistics Canada will release GDP by industry figures for February on Friday. Beavers are getting the blame for a weekend internet outage in the community of Tumbler Ridge, BC. Telus says internet services for about 900 homes and businesses and 60 cable customers were first disrupted early Saturday. Liz Sauve of Telus says crews sent to investigate found a nearby beaver dam where the animals dug along the creek to reach the cable, which was buried about a meter down. She says the beavers first chewed through a 4.5-inch thick conduit tube, then through the cable in numerous locations. Bianca Andreescu says a positive COVID-19 test will keep her out of this week's Madrid Open. The 2019 U.S. Open championship winner says she tested negative twice before her flight and says she was sadly informed that she tested positive when she landed in the Spanish capital. The 20-year-old from Mississauga says she feels good, but she is resting and following the health protocols and safety guidelines. All right, stay with us. This past week, we took a deeper look at France's recent handling of an anti-Semitism case and the international implications of a recent court decision. We spoke with Avi Ben-Lolo, national award-winning expert in the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, human rights, and Israel. We'll be right back with this and more national and international news on the Forum Daily Week in Review. Crowds gathered in France, Israel, the UK, and the US Sunday to denounce a ruling by France's highest court that the killer of a Jewish woman, Sarah Halimi, was not criminally responsible and therefore could not go on trial. The decision sparked outrage among the French and international Jewish community. Ms. Halimi, a 65-year-old Jewish woman, died in 2017 after being pushed out of the window of her Paris apartment by her neighbor, Kobili Traoré, who allegedly shouted Allahu Akbar, meaning God is great in Arabic. Mr. Traoré admitted to pushing her. The ruling from the Court of Cassation, issued earlier this month, said there was enough evidence to show the act had anti-Semitic motives. But Mr. Traoré had been delirious at the time because he was high on cannabis. Meanwhile, human rights advocates are speaking out against this recent ruling on the heels of the Derek Chauvin trial in the U.S. Joining us now is Mr. Avi Ben-Lolo, national award-winning expert in the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, human rights, and Israel. Welcome to Forum Daily, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Mr. Ben-Lolo, you recently wrote an open letter directly to French President Macron regarding this case. Can you tell us what was in this letter?
Yes, look, I wrote to the president directly himself, and I've previously sat down with his predecessor, President Hollande, at the Élysée Palace, and we had chatted about terrorism there. And of course, President Hollande at that time said he's very concerned about the influx of terrorists into France. And so what we're in fact seeing is that the result of that radicalism that is growing against the Jewish community. And so I wrote to President Macron asking him, because look, he has condemned anti-Semitism before. He has stood with the Jewish community, and we're most appreciative of that. But at the same time, this trial was a complete farce. Not only a farce for for the Jewish community, but a farce for human rights in general. It actually, when you look at the judgment, anyone who smokes up can get away with any crime, and that could affect anybody. And so when we're speaking out against Sarah Halimi, this poor elderly woman, 65 years old, who was thrown out off of her third floor balcony by this deranged lunatic who was screaming at her anti-Semitic epithets. What we're saying is this is wrong. This is against human rights, and it's farce. It's a farce to have acquitted him in such a way. And so I'm asking President Macron to press for an immediate retrial because it's just unacceptable.
And how does France compare to other countries in its efforts to stem anti-Semitism and racism over the years?
Look, the problem with France is that in France, what you see is violent anti-Semitism. And so, if you look back at the last, even decade only, but it goes well beyond that, we've had another youth by the name of Ilan Halimi, a Jewish youth who was murdered on his way home. He was actually, burned and beaten savagely. And then in Toulouse, there were four in front of a school. There was a rabbi and three children murdered in cold blood by a radical Islamist in front of their school. Then last year, actually, a Holocaust survivor was stabbed to death in her own apartment. And I should go back even before that, in 2015, if we all recall, the Charlie Hebdo massacre. And on the heels of that massacre, the extremists went into a kosher market, because that was where Jews go to, and murdered 4 Jews there. And so, when you're looking at anti-Semitism in France, it's violent in comparison to many other places. And unfortunately, the scourge of anti-Semitism is increasing all over the world. But in France in particular, it's violent.
Now, we've got a little over a minute left, sir, but what does a ruling like this mean for the safety of the Jewish community in France?
Look, the Jewish community is unhappy. There were approximately 30,000 protesters in Paris just this weekend. You know, we know that many have left France over the last 2 decades. It just feels very unsafe to them. And some of them, have bought apartments in Israel and other places, so that they can get out when they need to, because, it doesn't appear at this juncture like there is a future for the Jewish community. And that's actually a sad state of affairs for France itself, which is a leading Western democracy. It's a beautiful country. It's fantastic. And, for a minority group to want to leave this country because of racism and discrimination, it's a sad state of affairs.
All right, Mr. Ben Lello, thank you again for giving us your time today on Forum Daily and sharing this very important information.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Stay with us. More to come on the Forum Daily Weekend Review. More than 1,000 dock workers at the Port of Montreal began a strike on Monday, a move that the Port Authority said would mean the total shutdown of all port operations. The move was aiming to put pressure on the Maritime Employers Association to reach a contract with dock workers because they haven't had one since December 2018. Federal Labor Minister Philomena Tassi has tabled controversial back-to-work legislation aimed at getting the 1,150 dock workers back on the job. Well, to talk more on the significant impact the strike has on not only the economy, but trade and international commitments, we are joined by Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Welcome back to Forum Daily, Brendan.
Morning, Nima.
Now, this isn't the first time that a strike was held at the Port of Montreal. There was a similar strike action back in the summer of 2020. So what kind of economic and logistical impact did the 2020 strike have on Canada's economy?
Well, it wasn't great. Now, when you say it's not the first time it's happened, it's not the first time it's happened during COVID. So we are all in this together, yet the federal government that owns the Port of Montreal and the dock workers can't seem to get it together in a critical lynch point for our economy. So we're all in this together, except we're not. So the impact on the economy was tremendous. It's hundreds of millions of dollars of goods is left on the docks. I was talking last night to the owner of a medical and healthcare supply company who's had hand sanitizers and others just sitting by the docks because of a global shutdown in trade. Or it's already been challenging enough to get goods from other parts of the world because of issues the other parts of the world are having, both nationalistic and logistic. So for Canada to be competitive, we have to literally be all in this together, as opposed to fighting amongst ourselves. Because if we do not hang together, to borrow from Benjamin Franklin, if we do not hang together, we shall all surely hang separately.
Now, this is Canada's second largest port we're talking about. So how would this impact already stressed supply chains and deliveries for companies across Canada?
It's not great, Nima. Again, getting goods out of parts of the world, particularly China, has been challenging, but all countries have had their supply chains disrupted. And what we've really learned through this pandemic is that we all depended on each other. For this world to function, if you don't like the buzzword globalization, fine, we'll change it. But for us to exist as a species on this planet, we have to work together. And I understand that countries that are doing less well than Canada are having a hard time making that working well happen. But here in Canada, it's not been great, but it's not been as bad as the rest of the world. And we need to be able to find ways to make our ports, our infrastructure work, so that at least internally we can work together, and externally we put our best foot and face forward for working with and indeed competing with the rest of the world.
Now, considering the future impacts of this, we saw certain shipping lines diverting their routes from the Port of Montreal to competing ports due to the uncertainty of the summer 2020 strike. What does a second major strike in less than a year mean for the future success of the port itself, Brendan?
Well, it's not good for Canada as a whole. It's not good for Quebec specifically. I imagine that more business is going west to Vancouver, even to Toronto, perhaps to Halifax. So for Quebec, which has been in recovery mode for a long time. And keep in mind, COVID's hit Quebec harder than any other province in this nation. To get this, when I said about Canada I don't want to tell Quebec how to do its business, but within its own province, it's got to work together to be able to compete. Otherwise, yeah, CN and CP and the different rail lines will need to ship to other ports, and that doesn't help Quebec, and they need it more than any other province in this country right now.
Right, Brendan. Now, we've got a little over a minute left, but I really want to bring this back home to our Canadian viewers now. How would a strike like this impact Canadian families in particular?
Well, I think emotionally to start with, many people have lost their jobs, lost their businesses, and if the federal government and a federal union, which is what the dock workers are, can't get it together, and it's not as though the dock workers haven't been paid, it's just they haven't had a contract since 2018. So if they can't get it together and work together, then what does that mean emotionally, let alone financially and in terms of getting hand sanitizers and anything else they need for Canadian families that really are suffering, that haven't been paid, that have lost their businesses or lost their jobs? It is a very stressful time, and I cannot say this enough. We as a country, Quebec as a province, all of the provinces together have to work together because it's challenging for us. It's even more challenging for the rest of the world. And if we're going to face the rest of the world and indeed compete with the rest of the world, we have to work together, and that is a non-negotiable.
All right, Brendan, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today. Asian shares rose in trading today after U.S. President Joe Biden delivered a speech to Congress last night that outlines ambitious plans for jobs, creating spending on early education, childcare, and other public services.
Peril into possibility, crisis to opportunity, setbacks into strength. We all know life can knock us down, but in America, we never, ever stay down. Americans always get up. Today, that's what we're doing. America's rising anew, choosing hope over fear, truth over lies, and light over darkness.
Mr. Biden ticked off details of some of his plan for $1.8 trillion in spending to expand preschool, create a national family and medical leave program, distribute child care subsidies, and more. Well, Senator Tim Scott was the lawmaker tapped to give the Republican response to Joe Biden's address to Congress. And he used it to credit the GOP for leading the country out of its pandemic struggles and toward a hopeful future. But Mr. Scott saved his sharpest words for the subject of race, accusing Democrats of tearing the country apart and suggesting that they use the issue as a political weapon. The head of the World Health Organization says more than 1 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines have been administered globally, but 82% of them were given in high and upper middle income countries. WHO Director General Ghebreyesus says just 0.3% of all vaccines administered so far were given to people in low income countries. He said access to vaccines is one of the defining challenges of the pandemic and that public health is the foundation of social, economic, and political stability. China's Maritime Safety Agency says a dozen vessels are at work cleaning up about 400 tons of oil that spilled into the sea from a tanker near a busy port following a collision. The tanker, a Symphony, was struck Tuesday by a cargo ship in the Yellow Sea outside Qingdao, southeast of Beijing. The tanker's manager says the collision ruptured some of its cargo and ballast tanks. The Maritime Safety Administration gave no other details. Ethiopia has swept up thousands of ethnic Tigrayans into detention centers across the country on accusations that they are traitors, often holding them for months without charges. The detentions of both civilians and military personnel are an apparent attempt to purge state institutions of the Tigrayans who once dominated them, as the government enters its 6th month of fighting in the Tigray region. The detentions are far more sweeping in scope and more arbitrary than Ethiopia has acknowledged, sometimes with ethnic profiling as the sole reason. The ruling military in Myanmar has reportedly launched airstrikes against ethnic minority guerrillas in 2 areas of the country. Officials say the fighting has been raging for days in 2 regions, one in the north and the other in the east. Both groups have struck alliances with the popular movement opposing the military junta that seized power in the country in February after ousting the elected government. Kabul's young working women say they fear their dreams may be short-lived if the Taliban return to Kabul, even if peacefully as part of a new government. The militants imposed a harsh brand of rule when they held power from 1996 to 2001. They banned education for girls and denied women the right to work or even travel outside of their home unaccompanied by a man. Rights activists say they want the world to demand guarantees from the Taliban to protect women's rights. Young women who grew up under the small gains in the past 20 years fear no one will defend them if they are reversed. At the heart of India's farm protests and decades-old agrarian crisis is a policy issue. India has been subsidizing the cultivation of rice in the north, but these are thirsty crops that have dramatically lowered the groundwater table. The protesting farmers are overwhelmingly from the region that has benefited from most of the policies for maximizing food production. But the policies aimed at providing a surplus have deepened India's water crisis. The groundwater in Punjab, a state with 27 million people, is projected to dry up entirely by 2039. A man considered by millions of Venezuelans as the doctor of the poor is set to be beatified, a step toward sainthood. Jose Gregorio Hernandez, who died in 1919, will be beatified Friday during a ceremony in Venezuela's capital. Dr. Hernandez was a physician, university professor, and researcher. The case that prompted the beatification was that of a girl who was seriously injured after being shot in the head, who managed to recover completely in a miracle attributed to Dr. Hernandez. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and be sure to follow us on our social media handles, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for updates. You can also watch all our commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thank you for joining us on the Forum Daily Weekend Review, and we'll see you again next time. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye for now.